What you're about to hear is part 5 of a multi-part series on the First World War. If you haven't caught the earlier episodes and you want to know what's going on, it might be worth your time to go back and listen to them. If you've already heard them or you don't care about stuff like that, then please join us for part 5 of Blueprint for Armageddon.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
It's history.
One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The events.
The figures.
Not quite to the noise, man. Let the word humanity.
From this time and place,
I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
The drama.
Marine 6. Tower 2 has had a major explosion and what appears to be a complete collapse surrounding the entire area.
I welcome this kind of examination because people have got to know whether or not their
The
president's a
deep
crook.
questions.
Well, I'm not a crook.
If we dig deep in our history and our doctrine, and remember that we are not descended from fearful men.
It's hardcore history.
Earlier in this story, we brought up the often quoted phrase that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. And we brought it up in relation to the man who actually launched the incident that sparked the First World War, the Serbian nationalist Gavrilo Princip, who killed the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, thereby precipitating the crisis that actually started the war. The Austro-Hungarians saw Princip unequivocally as a terrorist. His Serbian nationalist brethren revered him. In fact, not that long ago, a statue was unveiled in Sarajevo where the assassination happened, honoring the assassin. So your view of the motives of these people really depends on, who's doing the viewing at the time. Princip is far from the only figure in this story who falls into a similar category. The United States is dealing with one themselves in 1916. For example, in January 1916, just as the German military is putting the finishing touches on what will become the quintessentially horrible Battle of Verdun, the quintessentially 20th century style battle, the killing field created by mass artillery, the meat grinder that will be Verdun, the United States' attention is taken off European affairs by events going on in northern Mexico. Mexico has been convulsed by revolution since 1910. Northern Mexico often becomes one of these hotbeds of unrest and instability. And in January 1916, gunmen waylay a train in northern Mexico. Now, this is at the tail end of the era where train robberies are not uncommon, but these gunmen aren't there to rob the train. In fact, as they go up and down the aisles, they leave the Mexican nationals, the locals, alone. But they pull off every American from the train that they find. And they find 16 to 18 workers, employees of a U.S. corporation operating in northern Mexico. They take these Americans off the train, line them up in front of the tracks, force them to strip, and then execute them. We know this because one of the Americans feigned death and got away and told his story. I believe he said that the bodies were also mutilated. This very well may have been an attempt to provoke a response on the part of the U.S. government, and if so, the mutilation is just part of adding fuel to the fire, a little something to make the U.S. government even angrier at this event. And things had been escalating to this point in northern Mexico for some time. Groups affiliated with these same gunmen had been attacking isolated Americans, a murder here, a murder there, a rape here or there, but this was upping the ante significantly. Nonetheless, the maneuver accomplished nothing concrete of note. So a couple of months later, In March 1916, this group of gunmen or outlaws or revolutionaries, if you're looking at it from another point of view, up the ante again and cross the U.S.-Mexican border in strength. More than 100 go after American interest on the U.S. side of the border, culminating in an attack on a U.S. city, Columbus, New Mexico, in the middle of the night. They roar through this town, shooting, looting, killing, and burning. 18 Americans will be killed. The town will be burned down, and the bandits or terrorists or revolutionaries, depending on your point of view, will escape back into Mexico. Now, as a side note, then as now, Americans are a heavily armed people, and those bandits paid a high price for what they did to that town. Many more of them died than Americans died. Nonetheless, the idea that you were safe and protected within the confines of the U.S. borders was shattered in a way that hadn't happened since the Apache Wars in that region had ended 30 years previously. The attackers of Columbus, New Mexico, were affiliated with a Mexican revolutionary leader known to history, not his actual name, as Pancho Villa. Now, Villa almost certainly wasn't in Columbus, New Mexico. He had been hurt not that long before, but these gunmen were part of, his men. And if you look at this superficially, there's a lot of similarities between Pancho Villa and Osama bin Laden. Now, this is not said to insult Mexican folks who still, in some cases, revere Pancho Villa's memory, but it's hard to avoid that, at least from the American side of things, there are rough analogies that you can, point to. For example, like bin Laden, Villa had once upon a time been a friend to the United States, someone we thought we could work with and use and arm and train and help. In fact, after that attack in Columbus, New Mexico, when it was obvious that some response had to be put together, President Woodrow Wilson, the American leader, launches an expedition, a military expedition into northern Mexico, sends about 5,000 men across the border. There was an official leader, but he wasn't the guy who actually led things on the ground. The guy who led things on the ground was an American general named John Pershing, whose nickname, by the way, was Black Jack. And a year before, to show you how close the United States had been to Villa at one time, the year before Pershing launches this expedition to go capture this terrorist, Pancho Villa, he loses his whole family in a terrible house fire. Pershing's wife and his little girls, they were little children, died in the fire. And as he was wallowing in almost soul-crushing grief, amongst the condolence letters he received was one from this Pancho Villa person that he would be chasing about a year later. There are a lot of interesting things that this expedition across the border shows, not just Mexicans, not just Americans, but European observers everywhere who all throughout this war have wondered what the United States is going to do and what their capabilities are. All of a sudden, they have a U.S. military force in the field to have a look at and measure up against the standards of early 20th century warfare. And to be honest, the American endeavor looks like a disaster. It doesn't look a whole lot different than efforts 30 years ago to the year that were launched to go after the last Apache leader to, break off the U.S. reservation system with 40 warriors and go into some of this same country that Villa and his men were hiding in. Looks like a very similar army, just add some motor cars, which is what the U.S. military was employing to give them some mobility, and some airplanes that look like they were invented by the Wright brothers themselves. In fact, the pilots were trained in some cases by Orville and Wilbur Wright. That's how recent airplane development is, and the U.S. planes are so rickety and so new that none of them survive the first week or two of operation down there. One of the more interesting aspects to the U.S. operations in northern Mexico to go get Pancho Villa is the U.S. doesn't know northern Mexico, and their maps are all wrong, and so they have leading their army as scouts Apaches. And these Apaches include, allegedly, some Apache scouts who were amongst the Apache scouts that hunted down Geronimo 30 years before. In fact, there's quite a connection to a lot of these people involved in this conflict. General John Blackjack Pershing was a junior officer trailing Geronimo 30 years before these events. It's believed that Pancho Villa wanted to get the U.S. to attack northern Mexico and bog them down in this insane country to fight in. Insane terrain, insane weather conditions, and thereby raise his standing amongst several revolutionary leaders vying for control of the instability in Mexico that had been going on since the 1910 revolution began. But if Europeans already had a stereotypical view of the United States as a nation of cowboys and an army mired in an almost Old West sort of approach, the expedition into northern Mexico to capture Pancho Villa did nothing to disabuse them of that stereotype. To many European observers, it wasn't just a frontier army that the United States of America looked like they possessed. It was kind of a frontier mentality to go along with it. And one of the things that was really hard for European planners is that, on both sides of the war, by the way, is that it began to look more and more like the United States was going to play this huge role in the war. But what did that even mean? The United States had never sent over lots of men to go fight in some European war. It was alien to the American experience. So would they actually do that? There were a lot of European observers that thought that even if the U.S. got into the war, they wouldn't send troops. Americans don't do that. And that's part of what makes that pre-First World War United States of America hard for modern Americans to understand. You know, if you know your grandparents, if you're lucky enough to have met your grandparents, you can explain them to other people. You begin to get a real feel for what they're about, even if they're very different than you are. But they're real. You can relate to them. The United States of 1916 is like a great-great-great-grandparent. You can read all about it you want, but those people are different from you, and you don't understand them, and you never knew them. You never knew anyone like them. The modern United States of America is the most interventionist great power in the world. In 1916, it was the opposite. And it had a long mythology connected to its very founding that reinforced the idea that that's the way American foreign policy should be. Before the United States could involve itself in the First World War, it had to somehow deal with this lasting legacy dating all the way back to, pre-revolutionary days. But why don't you just start with the farewell speech of the first American president, George Washington? A speech that was reread aloud once a year in patriotic fervor. A speech that told Americans to stay out of Europe's wars. In the middle of his goodbye speech to the American people and his resigning from public life, he said, quote, "The great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is in extending our commercial relations, to have with them as little political connection as possible. So far as we've already formed engagements, let them be fulfilled with perfect good faith. Here, let us stop. Europe has a set of primary interests, which to us have none or very remote relation. Hence, she must be engaged in frequent controversies, the causes of which are essentially foreign to our concerns. Hence, therefore, it must be unwise in us to implicate ourselves by artificial ties in the ordinary vicissitudes of her politics, or the ordinary combinations and collisions of her friendships or enmities. Our detached and distant situation invites and enables us to pursue a different course. If we remain one people under an efficient government, the period is not far off when we may defy material injury from external annoyance, when we may take such an attitude as will cause the neutrality we may at any time resolve upon to be scrupulously respected, when belligerent nations, under the impossibility of making acquisitions upon us, will not lightly hazard the giving us provocation, which we may choose peace or war as our interest, guided by justice, shall counsel. Why forego the advantages of so peculiar a situation? Why quit our own to stand upon foreign ground? Why, by interweaving our destiny with that of any part of Europe, entangle our peace and prosperity in the toils of European ambition, rivalship, interest, humor, or caprice? It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world." End quote. When Americans revere those people like demigods, and that speech is reread to American school children and reread publicly once a year on the anniversary, you can see that if you were an American who thought that the United States should enter the First World War, you have a lot of mythology to overcome, a lot of ingrained ideological training. Unless you think that those are revolutionary sentiments, from the beginning of a nation, a lot of times people are very emotional and sentimental and lofty and idealistic when a nation is founded, and that cools over time. 45 years after Washington gave that speech, the current president of the United States, a second-generation guy like George W. Bush, kind of, John Quincy Adams, gave another one of these foreign policy speeches, coining a famous phrase that Americans would use ever since, going abroad in search of monsters to slay. The very antithesis of the idea that the United States government is going to use as the slogan to get the United States into the First World War. John Quincy Adams, in the middle of one of his speeches, dealing with what the country's foreign policy should be 45 years after Washington gave his speech, said, quote, speaking about the United States here in the feminine pronoun, by the way, quote, "Wherever the standard of freedom and independence has been or shall be unfurled, there will her heart, her benedictions, and her prayers be. But she goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She is the well-wisher to the freedom and independence of all. She's the champion and vindicator only of her own. She will recommend the general cause by the countenance of her voice and the benignant sympathy of her example. She well knows that by once enlisting under other banners than her own, were they even the banners of foreign independence, she would involve herself beyond the power of extrication in all the wars of interest and intrigue, of individual avarice, envy, and ambition, which assume the colors and usurp the standard of freedom. The fundamental maxims of her policy would insensibly change from liberty to force. The frontlet upon her brows would no longer beam with the ineffable splendor of freedom and independence, but in its stead would soon be substituted an imperial diadem, flashing in false and tarnished luster the murky radiance of dominion and power. She might become the dictatress of the world. She would be no longer the ruler of her own spirit." End quote. This kind of historical legacy of idealism, this mythology, if you will, that Americans had reinforced all the time, provided a natural counterweight for patriots to choose a side that seemed to be, opposite of what patriotism normally implied. In Europe, patriotism was a key part of nationalism. It's the, grabbing of the flag sometimes and pushing your nation's glory and borders farther. That was true in the United States, too. Everybody's human. The same sorts of, rallying cries often work on Americans that work on other people. But you also had this refuge for people who were patriotic and who could take an anti-interventionist position and couch it as much in the flag as those who were suggesting that real patriots, joined up and fought the Spanish in Cuba, for example, as Theodore Roosevelt, the former president of the United States and volunteer for that Spanish-American War, kept taking the opposite viewpoint, that the United States of America lived in a different time than those founding fathers, and that real patriotism and real men would be ready to join the First World War, and the United States is looking like a coward by not being involved. But Theodore Roosevelt is not the president in 1916, but he's needling the guy who is, a guy from the other party, a Democrat named Woodrow Wilson, one of the most enigmatic and hard to get your mind around figures in this story. And part of the reason that Wilson is so hard to figure out is because the historians don't agree. The majority of historians have always taken Wilson sort of at face value and portray him as one of the most, if not the most, idealistic president in American history. A guy who is so peace-loving, he's virtually Gandhi-esque, and a man who did everything he could to keep the United States out of war and to fight for this wonderful, just, fair peace afterwards. That's the sort of the good Wilson. I divide them into the good Wilson and the evil Woodrow Wilson in terms of how some historians see it. The other historical camp is smaller, but very vociferous, very loud, and growing. And those are the people who, for a lot of domestic reasons, it should be pointed out, don't like Woodrow Wilson at all. And often, ascribe sinister or venal motives for him doing what he was doing. And that see a man who wanted to get involved with the Allies, who sought peace for his own vainglorious reasons, who was a schemer and a person who hid behind a mask that promised, idealism and peace. And there were German generals, for example, who were never falling for that story that Wilson was some Bambi deer in the headlights on the world stage, and always thought that that was just a really good mask that his Machiavellian schemings hid behind, making him even more dangerous. I guess his disguise was better. Nonetheless, I'm not going to wade as a fan of history into which Wilson I believe was the real Wilson, but look at how it adds to the uncertainty of the whole thing. What is this guy all about? Now, I personally think that the air of mystery that surrounds Woodrow Wilson makes him a more interesting character. I mean, he's a giant enigma that's quickly becoming perhaps the most important single individual in the story by the end of 1916. But, I didn't have to live with him. People in this tale, he's not a character, he's a world leader, and what the United States does in this war might decide the conflict, so the stakes couldn't be higher. Winston Churchill, writing after the First World War, he's got a very interesting view on Wilson. It's hard to describe. You can see he's walking on eggshells sometimes. But he says, this guy, we didn't know anything about him. I mean, he comes out of academia, basically, and he says only in the American system do you get these people that can come from totally outside politics as complete unknowns. He goes, in Britain, such a prime minister would have spent years in the House of Commons or what have you, working their way up. They would be in the public eye the whole time. They would be a known quantity by the time they got the top job. He marvels at the fact that Woodrow Wilson is an unknown, the most powerful man in the United States, and quickly becoming the most important single figure in the war. Churchill writes about Wilson, quote, "In all his strength and in all his weakness, in his nobility and in his foibles, he was, in spite of his long academic record and brief governorship, an unknown, an unmeasured quantity to the mighty people who made him their ruler in 1912. Still more was he a mystery to the world at large. Writing with every sense of respect, it seems no exaggeration to pronounce that the action of the United States, with its repercussions on the history of the world, depended, during the awful period of Armageddon, upon the workings of this man's mind and spirit, to the exclusion of almost every other factor, and that he played a part in the fate of nations incomparably more direct and personal than any other man." End quote. That's why we're talking about the United States so much in this episode. And one of the other parts of the Wilson story that are interesting is when you get human beings in positions of great power and authority, oftentimes their little quirks or idiosyncrasies or characteristics can make or break history. I mean, we all have little things about us that might be quirky or idiosyncratic, but because we're not in positions of power and authority, they don't really make much of a difference. If Adolf Hitler leaves the military after the First World War as a decorated corporal and goes and opens up a sausage shop in Munich, his quirks and idiosyncrasies and characteristics don't make a big difference on the world stage. You probably never hear about them. They only affect, the people he has contact with. But you take that same figure and you make him the iron-fisted dictator of one of the great 20th century nations on the planet, and all of a sudden that man's quirks and idiosyncrasies and characteristics can create a deadly holocaust. Now, Wilson didn't have those kinds of characteristics, at least I haven't heard that even from the evil Wilson camp, but he did have characteristics that impacted this whole situation. One was, he was almost always convinced that he was right. Paraphrasing here, but he said something to the effect of once that he felt pity for people who had different opinions than him because he knew they were wrong. You can watch the way he operates in government, and he's a supremely gifted politician. But a lot of times those people are unwilling to let other men carry out, their policies and their programs because they know they could do it better. And you can see that from Wilson, too. After the war, the man who's going to become the British Prime Minister, a guy named David Lloyd George, will have to sit by the French military leader on one side and the President of the United States on the other. And he said it was like sitting between Napoleon on one side, and that was the French leader, and Jesus on the other. That was Woodrow Wilson. And Jesus was probably more the way that Wilson saw himself, is what George was trying to convey, than the way others saw him. Negotiating with a savior can require a deft touch. And Wilson's demeanor and sort of professorial air of superiority and that I'm always right kind of savior air about him sometimes rubbed some people the wrong way, and certainly influenced the way that Wilson handled things. And there were several big challenges to American neutrality that Wilson had to deal with, and all were especially acute in 1916. One involved American lives, the other involved American money, and the last involved an American election. Start with perhaps the number one most obvious thing sucking the United States into the whirlpool, the vortex of the First World War. And it was something that was so obviously doing that you can feel the momentum even now, reading the history books about this sort of slide into a war because the Germans' use of this thoroughly modern science fiction almost weapon, the submarine. The submarine was creating conditions where a couple of Americans here and there every now and then were dying on ships. Every now and then it was worse than that. When the Lusitania went down, which was a Titanic-like liner to a submarine torpedo, more than 100 Americans went down with that ship. How long would any nation put up with that? And the problem is that the U.S. would complain, they'd work something out with the Germans, tensions would drop, and then a month and a half later, boom, it happens again. It's like a sore that kept getting poked with a needle before it was able to heal. And yet, Wilson kept making the conditions more and more impossible to fulfill. So those anti-Wilsonian historians who say, no, you misunderstand. Wilson was trying to create the conditions that the Germans couldn't help but violate and then get the United States into the war and then claim it was foisted upon the Americans. For example, Wilson at one point in his administration, with high-minded rhetoric and speeches, was defending the right of an American passenger. And remember, Americans could travel on American ships or neutral ships, and at certain times the Germans had sworn they wouldn't go after those. But Wilson was defending the right of an American to travel on a British ship or a French ship, right, a belligerent ship, and defending their right to travel on a belligerent ship even if it was carrying munitions, and defending their right to travel on a belligerent ship carrying munitions that also was carrying defensive guns on it that could hurt a submarine. That's when the Germans would throw up their hands and say that to them, Wilson didn't look like an honest broker. That's the kind of guy you're going to trust with peace? I mean, look, and their attitude was he doesn't hold the British to any of these same rules he's trying to hold us to. The British had a blockade going. They didn't use submarines, they used mines. And they would mine the North Sea and they'd create these zones where they would stop every liner they could get their hands on, make it go to a British port, search it, decide it was contraband. And Wilson and his administration were pretty darn quiet about that. Occasional protest and nothing more. To the Germans, this looked like rank hypocrisy. And to anti-Wilsonian historians, to them it looks like a perfect example to show that really these ideals that Wilson professed were very conveniently ignored when they ran against what he wanted. There were other complications that affected what he wanted too. One had to do with perhaps the most ancient of motivations of all, economic ones. The United States was making a killing in the First World War by 1916, pardon the pun. And it began to affect its entire outlook toward the conflict. It's one of the longest term impacts, by the way, of the First World War the results of which we live with every day in our modern world, but it sort of sinks beneath the radar. It's a lot easier to understand the submarine warfare question than it is the economic transfer of wealth from Europe to the United States. This war was so total in its stakes that the sides fighting it found no good reason not to spend every bit of capital they had to win it. When Britain started this war in 1914, she was the richest country in the world. It was not long after the era where the phrase, "the sun never sets on the British Empire," was in vogue. The British Empire controlled, directly or indirectly, about a third of the planet. She was wealthy, and she'd been sucking up a lot of the wealth of Europe for 100 years. During Europe's most dominant time period on the world stage, the era of colonies and post-Napoleonic splendor, right? The Victorian Age. And yet, when 1914 started, the British didn't just have their own bills to pay in this most expensive of all human conflicts. They underwrote their dominions, the Canadas, the Australias, the New Zealand. They underwrote countries like Italy and paid for almost all their costs during the war. The Russians, too, and a lot of other small powers. The amounts of money that were changing hands, I've seen so many different attempts to come up with it. All you have to know, though, is it's ungodly. At one point, it was like $75 million a week in 1916 money. It's incredible, the wealth transfer. And when Britain started buying stuff from places like the United States, when the war started, they used cash and gold. By 1916, we're talking about credit and debt. And if you wanted to think of New York as being like a giant vacuum cleaner with the sucking hose end in London just sucking out 100 years of civilizational wealth acquirement, that's not a bad image. In 4 years, the center of world banking, as we said in an earlier episode, is transferred from London to New York. Same thing for the center of world trade. And all of a sudden, by 1916, Wilson is acquiring a huge amount of power because the United States is the banker, and these people are beginning to owe it money. The British realize it at the same time. Historian Justice Donachie writes about Wilson's new ability, because he controls the purse strings of the Allied side in this war, to dictate any sort of outcome he might want. Donachie writes, quote, "If Wilson desired to force the Allies to the peace table, the opportunity had come, and he knew it. On October 3rd, 1916, a British interdepartmental conference noted the nation's utter dependence upon American munitions, steel, foodstuffs, oil, wheat, cotton, and lubricants. Were the United States to engage in economic reprisals, Britain's war effort would practically stop. Of the £5 million sterling needed to prosecute the war, reported a government economist, John Maynard Keynes, later that week, $2 million must come from North America. Quote, in a few months' time, claimed the Treasury official, the American public will be in a position to dictate to this country on matters that affect us more nearly than them. End quote. The author continues, quote, Reginald McKenna, Chancellor of the Exchequer, concurred with Keynes, telling the cabinet in late October, quote, by next June or earlier, the President of the American Republic will be in a position, if he wishes, to dictate his own terms to us. End quote. The author says, at the end of December, McKenna told an American journalist that Wilson could, quote, force the Allies to their knees any time in a moment. End quote. The United States in late 1916 is like a bank. And Europe, and especially Great Britain, who is the financial underwriter of the whole Allied war effort, basically, owes the bank money. That gives the bank a lot of power. But there's an old line in banking that if you owe the bank a little bit of money, it's the bank who has the power. But if you owe a bank a lot of money, that power goes back to the person that owes the money, because the bank now has a vested interest in seeing that that person survives so that they can pay them back. The United States is beginning to worry about what happens if we can't sell this war material anymore, or if we can't get paid for the credit we're loaning out. The U.S. has had a very uncomfortable sort of prosperity descend on it in the past 2 years. In 1914, when the First World War breaks out, the American economy is not doing well at all. by 1916, halfway through the year, the American economy is humming along nicely, thank you. Some historians have actually called the United States a nation of war profiteers at this point. If Wilson was successful in creating a negotiated peace at the end of 1916 somehow, and you wanted to, at that point, declare the winner in the First World War, do you know which two powers I'd nominate? I'd nominate Japan and the United States. And the Japanese hardly fought in the war at all, and by the end of 1916, the United States hadn't fought in the war at all. Those are the victors. The Japanese get involved in 1914 for purely opportunistic reasons. They can take over all the German holdings in their neck of the woods, and the Germans can't do anything. So you get all this territory for basically nothing. The United States is selling stuff. Amazing amounts of stuff. Both sides need everything, and the Americans will sell to anybody, but they can't get their stuff to Germany. They still made loans and tried to get stuff to them, but by and large, the British blockade had shut that down. But you could still trade with the British, and we did. And the idea that that trade might somehow go away began to filter into the halls of government. The prosperity that this war brought the United States created another vested interest. And there are economic historians and with more economic motivations for why countries do things that point to this as the most important undercurrent of why the war was really going the way it was. Now, there's another reason, too, and this is very pedestrian. But Woodrow Wilson in 1916 was an American president that faced an election campaign. And this is where the real uniqueness of the American situation is demonstrated. What does a president do who's running for re-election, and the big elephant in the living room situation is this war in Europe, when he's facing an electorate made up of immigrants, of people on both sides of that conflict in the old world? Historian David Stevenson does a great job breaking down, the ethnic makeup of the United States and showing you all these weird problems that the United States would have if it got into this conflict that other nations wouldn't. For example, he points out that large chunks of the United States is made up of immigrants from some of these countries. The two main groups that are problematic for anyone who wants to talk about siding with the Allies in this First World War are German Americans and Irish Americans. Here's what Stevenson writes, quote, "Support for American neutrality was strongest in the interior, and especially the Middle West, where the German Americans were concentrated, of whom only an insignificant minority favored intervention on the side of the Central Powers. Of a U.S. population in 1910 of 92 million, he writes, 2.5 million had been born in Germany, and 5.78 million had one or two German-born parents. In 1917, 522 German-language newspapers and journals were published in the United States, and German Americans were the largest ethnic group in Baltimore, Pittsburgh, Chicago, Detroit, Los Angeles, and San Francisco," end quote. He then goes on to talk about Irish Americans who, and we didn't even get into this as a person of partly Irish American descent, I would have just gone off on the whole Irish uprising, the Easter uprising that happened during this conflict, of which the Germans may have had a role. The British considered this an especially nasty stab in the back since it happened during wartime, reacted by killing a lot of Irish, depends on if you're British, killing Irish leaders in the uprising, infuriating Americans of Irish descent, of which there were a ton. And so if you're a politician like Woodrow Wilson, you have to deal with the fact that you have a ton of voters who are the only people that can keep you in power, who are really interested in not joining the side of the Allies, maybe, or anyone. The slogan for the 1916 campaign that's most remembered on the Woodrow Wilson side is the one that said, quote, "He kept us out of war," end quote. That was a slogan that appealed to most Americans. Wilson's peace-oriented Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, had said at one point that New York and the major newspapers want war. The rest of the country wants peace. And if you're an American planner, it's interesting how many times you can open up the history books and see references to the uncertainty of what these large immigrant descendant populations would do if the U.S. joined the Allied side in the war. If you have 2.5 million Americans born in Germany, what are they going to do when war breaks out? Are these potential terrorists? And so it became quite an interesting issue before the conflict involved the United States as to whether or not the United States was unified in the idea that it would go fight on any side in this conflict. Now, what do you do if you're one of these American figures, perhaps one of the top politicians, who wants the United States to get into the First World War? What's your strategy for dealing with these Americans who don't want to go, who want to stay neutral? It may be a huge majority of the country during this time period. If you're a politician and you're used to sort of putting your finger in the wind and going in the direction the people want to go, but they don't want to go in the direction you want to go, what's your strategy for dealing with that? The strategy of several of the top political figures in this period was to play the super patriot card and to accuse Americans who disagreed with the idea of getting into the war as being disloyal. I mean, take, for example, the former president, Theodore Roosevelt. In 1916, Roosevelt is not running for president, but he's campaigning and helping the guy who is from his own party, the Republican that's challenging Woodrow Wilson in the November 1916 elections. Now, Roosevelt is in an interesting position here. He desperately wants to get into the First World War. He thinks it's cowardly that the U.S. is staying out. He is publicly slamming Woodrow Wilson from pillar to post for not wanting to get involved in the conflict. He compares him on the campaign trail to Pontius Pilate. In fact, he says Wilson's neutrality is worse than Pontius Pilate. Remember Pontius Pilate? He's the Roman official who, in the Bible, sentences Jesus to be crucified. That's a pretty good political slam at the president, isn't it? But then Roosevelt makes a point to go after what at the time were referred to as hyphenated Americans. You know, people who had a hyphen between their description of their nationality. German-Americans, Irish-Americans, Jewish-Americans. And there was a feeling amongst a lot of Americans that these people weren't real Americans, that they had conflicted loyalties. And there was also this idea that you had to have 100% loyalty to the United States, and any consideration with what the ancestral home might want was equivalent, in Roosevelt's own words, to being a moral traitor. And so how do you deal with the fact that you want the United States to do something that most Americans don't want it to do? You slam as traitors those who oppose it. Now, Wilson was in a bit of a different position because not only, many historians think, did he not want to get into the war maybe, but he certainly had a public persona of not wanting to get into the war. But Wilson didn't like anyone who disagreed with him. And you can see Wilson's attitude about those who would oppose his policies, even in peacetime, in his response to a telegram he received from an Irish-American, there's that hyphenation, right? Irish-American leader in September 1916, a guy named Jeremiah O'Leary. And O'Leary was telling Wilson something that's perfectly logical. He's explaining to him that all of these moves that seem to lean toward the Allied side of the war are going to be issues in the campaign, right? There's nothing controversial about that. O'Leary's cable said, quote, "Your foreign policies, your failure to secure compliance with all American rights, your leniency with the British Empire, your approval of war loans, the ammunition traffic are issues in this campaign." End quote. Most American political figures would understand that that's just someone from the opposition explaining that that's how the American political system works. There's nothing wrong with that, especially not in peacetime. Wilson wrote back to Jeremiah O'Leary, quote, "Your telegram received. I would feel deeply mortified to have you or anybody like you vote for me. Since you have access to many disloyal Americans, and I have not, I will ask you to convey this message to them." End quote. In other words, to simply oppose Woodrow Wilson's policies in peacetime doesn't make you part of the loyal opposition. It makes you disloyal. What is a president who feels that peacetime opposition to peacetime policies is disloyal? What's a guy like that going to do when it's no longer peacetime? Well, here's a little preview to think about. We still have laws on the books that we're currently enforcing and using in the war on terror that are President Wilson's response to critics who address him negatively in wartime. Unless you think that this is an overreaction, though, or maybe misplaced priorities,